All right, let's get right into it. We all know the name Nelson Mandela, right? But what was it, really, that made his leadership so incredibly powerful? How did it literally change a nation and inspire the entire world? Well, today, we're going to break down the blueprint of his unbelievable journey, from activist to icon. But we're going to start with a fact you might not know. His given name wasn't Nelson, it was Rolihlahla. And in his native Xhosa language, that name literally means troublemaker. Talk about prophetic, right? And that really brings us to the core question here. How on earth did a man named Troublemaker manage to shake the foundations of a brutal regime, only to become one of history's greatest peacemakers? That's the journey we're about to dive into. So, our story really starts with his awakening. We're going to trace how his earliest experiences lit the fuse that would eventually become a fire for global change. You know, what's so fascinating here is how all these different threads came together to shape the man he would become. His Xhosa upbringing, that wasn't just a detail, it gave him this core philosophy of Ubuntu, the idea that I am because we are. That sense of community would define everything. Then, at the University of Fort Hare, his political mind got sharpened alongside other future leaders of Africa. His law degree, that gave him the tools not just to protest the system, but to actually dismantle it from the inside out. And then came Johannesburg, and that's where he saw the brutal daily reality of apartheid, turning this abstract injustice into something he just could not ignore. But as his activism ramped up, the ground started shifting under his feet. And it's so important to understand this next part. Mandela and the ANC didn't start with violence. Not at all. They were pushed. This next chapter is all about a huge, and I'm sure agonizing, strategic shift. So you can see the two distinct phases right here. At first, it was all about nonviolent resistance, inspired by Gandhi. The thinking was, let's win the moral argument, let's expose their brutality. But when the state responds to peaceful protests with just overwhelming violence, well, the strategy had to change. The move to armed struggle wasn't about causing chaos for its own sake. It was a calculated, strategic response. The goal was to target symbols of power, disrupt the state, and basically force the government to the negotiating table when every other door had been slammed shut. And if you want to see exactly how that happened, this timeline makes it crystal clear. You have years of nonviolent protests, like the Defiance Campaign. Then, 1960, the Sharpeville Massacre. Police just opened fire on unarmed protesters. I mean, that was the point of no return. And what happens the very next year? Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, is formed. It was a direct, and you have to imagine, desperate consequence. Of course, this led to his capture and trial. But what looked like the end of his story actually became its most defining chapter. His imprisonment wasn't a pause in his life. It was the very crucible that forged him into a global icon. 27 years, just let that number sink in for a second. It's almost impossible to really wrap your head around. For nearly 3 decades, the world's most famous political prisoner was locked away, totally cut off, meant to be forgotten by the world. But he was anything but forgotten. And this is the incredible part. He never, ever stopped being a leader, even behind bars. Inside Robben Island, he was organizing debates, study groups. He basically turned a brute prison into a university. And here's the ultimate paradox. The government's attempt to silence him only made his voice louder. He became this global symbol, the face of the massive Free Nelson Mandela campaign that put unbelievable pressure on South Africa. And when all that pressure finally worked, and he walked free, he stepped into his most difficult role yet, taking a country that was teetering on the brink of civil war and somehow turning it into a nation. I mean, this might be the most extraordinary part of his entire story. After 27 years in a tiny cell, he comes out not seeking revenge, but talking about reconciliation. And this wasn't just talk. Get this, at his own presidential inauguration, he invited one of his former white jailers from Robben Island to be a VIP guest. Can you imagine? It was this stunning, powerful message to the whole world. The past happened, we will remember it, but it will not define our future. So how do you even begin to do that? Well, his single greatest tool was something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was a totally radical idea. This wasn't about Nuremberg-style trials to punish the old regime. It was about creating a public space where victims could finally tell their stories and be heard, and where the perpetrators could confess, trading the truth for amnesty. The goal wasn't vengeance. It was national healing. So let's zoom out. What can we pull from all this? What was the secret sauce? Well, his leadership wasn't just some kind of magic. You can actually understand it through a pretty clear framework. Let's break down that blueprint. Leadership experts actually have a name for Mandela's style. They call it transformational leadership. And this isn't about giving top-down orders. Nope. It's about inspiring people to go after a higher purpose, to believe in a better version of themselves and, well, a better version of their world. And it really breaks down into these 4 key pillars. First up, you've got idealized influence. This is all about being a moral role model. For Mandela, sacrificing 27 years of his life, that gave him a moral authority that was just untouchable. Second, inspirational motivation. He didn't just fight against apartheid. He painted this clear, powerful vision for something new, a rainbow nation that everyone could get behind. Third, intellectual stimulation. The guy wasn't rigid. He encouraged debate, he challenged old ways of thinking, like when he made the controversial call to start secret talks with the government while he was still in jail. And finally, individualized consideration. This one's about empathy. He famously learned Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors, just so he could understand them better. It was a gesture that totally disarmed and won over so many of his old enemies. At the end of the day, it all boils down to this one idea. Mandela's whole philosophy is right there in that quote. His real power didn't come from the position he held, but from the power and the dignity he worked to give back to every single person in South Africa. And that really leaves us with a huge question for our own time, doesn't it? In a world that feels more and more divided, Mandela's story isn't just history. It's a roadmap. It forces us to ask, how can we take these profound lessons of reconciliation and start using them to heal the fractures in our own communities right now, to build a new future?